A ridge of black stone rises against a Wyoming sky, the color of old lead, the kind of sky that has already decided what it intends to do. Snow moves sideways across the slope, not falling traveling. Below in the valley, a small town huddles under smoke from failing chimneys, roof lines beginning to sag, a warehouse standing taller than everything around it with its shutters bolted from the inside. A woman climbs the ridge alone, dragging a wooden sled loaded with beans and hog fat, her breath white, her hands raw inside cracked gloves. An old gray hound moves ahead of her through drifts that reach her thighs. She stops, turns her face into the wind. Something in the pitch of it has changed. Behind her, the sky darkens another shade. A single tin cup of cold coffee sits abandoned on a diner table 3 miles below, still steaming. Beside laughter she has already walked away from. She keeps climbing. The laughter began before the ink was dry, and Merritt Ainsworth kept her eyes on the page, as though the sound belonged to another county. The pen moved across the folded ownership paper with the same steady pressure she had once used to close a soldier's wound in a Virginia field tent, drawing a line that would not need to be redone. Around her, the warm interior of Halvard's diner filled with the particular resonance of men enjoying a certainty they had not earned. Coffee steamed in tin cups. The stove ticked in its corner. Outside the windows of Asphalt Junction, the November light had the bleached quality of a sun already halfway through its business of leaving. Silas Thorne leaned back in his chair with the practiced ease of a man who believed the room was his, to shape his broad carpenter's shoulders, finding the wood behind him the way a boat finds a slip. His beard was full, his hands large, his coffee cooling in front of him, because he had not yet decided the conversation was worth interrupting for a sip. The sentence he built came slow-savored, meant for every ear in the room to hold. Only fool in the Wyoming territory buys a cave before winter. Merritt folded the paper along its existing crease, slid it into the inside pocket of her coat, and turned to the bankrupt silverman across the table. Mordecai Pike smelled of old coffee and older regret. His coat still carrying the outside cold, his eyes bright with the relief of a person who had just converted a burden into currency. She spoke without decoration, in the same register she had used for 2 decades to ask questions whose answers might decide who lived through the night. Does the draft run deep in there, or does it cut across the entrance? Mordecai blinked at her. The question had no place in the theater the room was building. He worked his jaw, searching for the memory, the way a man searches a coat pocket for a coin he half remembers. Cuts across, I think. Mostly. I never stayed long. She buttoned her coat. She did not thank the waitress who had already begun pouring a cup she would not drink. The laughter followed her out the door in the way certain sounds follow a person meant to carry them, and she was 3 steps onto the boardwalk before it turned communal warm, the shared certainty of men who had been laughing at various things for 20 years without becoming richer by any of it. At the edge of the boardwalk, her hound was waiting. Bramble sat with the patient composure of an old dog who had learned to distinguish the world's noise from the world's news. Her gray muzzle lifted one ear slightly lower than the other from a long-ago encounter with a barbed wire fence in Montana. Her amber eyes did what they always did when Merritt returned from a room full of men. They searched her face, found nothing troubling, and moved on to the more interesting question of the wind. The sled waited past the smithy where Jonas Ainsworth had not yet come home to see it loaded. 50 pounds of pinto beans in a burlap sack, 2 tins of rendered hog fat wedged between them, all lashed to a rough pine frame with mule rope that had stiffened overnight into something closer to iron wire. She checked each knot with her thumb before she took the harness. The load had to move as though it were part of her body, or the ridge would find the seam and pull. The road out of Asphalt Junction rose in a slow northeast climb toward the stone face of Iron Kettle Ridge, where the cave waited in the shape of a horizontal shadow no one bothered to look at twice. Behind her, the town spread out in its low, durable disappointment, the general store with its warped porch, the smithy with its familiar chimney smoke, the warehouse of Rutherford Cade, rising taller than the buildings around it, the flag above its door hanging stiff in the afternoon wind. She had never quite understood what Cade meant by established families on that flag. In her experience, the families that most urgently needed credit were precisely the ones the man behind the ledger considered unestablished. The sled caught a frozen root beneath the thin snow, and she pulled left with both wrists to keep the load from sliding. A field surgeon in the second summer of the war had taught her the trick without meaning to. You never fight a stretcher, you guide it. The cold had settled into her knuckles an hour ago, and she gave it less attention than the task in front of her, the way she gave most discomforts less attention than they asked for. Bramble stopped every few yards, not out of hesitation, but the way an animal stops when the wind changes its report ears working independently, like small antennas calibrating to separate signals. Then one dropping the long, slow exhale that dissipated in white before her paws moved again. Vesper had once trusted this dog across 3 winters and 1 river crossing in Wyoming a decade back, and the hound had never once been wrong about the important things. Merritt watched her forward-carrying shoulders now, with the same trust she gave a wound that closed clean. She had learned to read weight and terrain by the time she was 12, hauling water uphill in Montana clay for a mother who did not have the strength for the last 100 yards. She had learned to read men in a Virginia field hospital where competence and cruelty often occupied the same face, and one had to sort them fast. She had learned to read money in the years after Appomattox widowed at 22, with no formal pay ever entered against her name, because the Army did not compensate what it did not want to acknowledge, keeping herself alive by 12 careful decisions a day rather than one large one. Now at nearly 40, she was learning to read stone. The distance from stretcher to sled to cave was shorter than it looked from the outside. Halfway up the ridge, the wind changed pitch, a lower register that came off the higher peaks, with a mineral taste to it, and Bramble's nose lifted toward the north for a full 3 breaths before she moved again. There was weather somewhere behind that pitch weather that had not yet made up its mind about where to stop. Merritt filed the observation the way she filed everything, without decoration, without alarm, in the place where it could be retrieved later without effort. The entrance appeared as she had remembered it, a narrow horizontal shadow at the base of the stone face, tilted slightly upward at the left corner, so unassuming that a man could ride past it 100 times before understanding what it was. She anchored the sled to a rock outcropping with the mule rope and drew the oil lamp from beneath her coat where she had kept it warm against her ribs. Bramble reached the threshold first, sniffed the vertical edge of the opening with the thoroughness of a person reading a document, and passed through without looking back. Merritt turned sideways to follow. The ceiling dropped inside the entry passage, and she lowered the lamp below chin height to keep the flame from being killed against damp rock. Her elbows brushed both walls when she bent them. The floor angled downward under her boots leveled out, and then the passage opened and the light of her lamp reached a room, 30 feet across at the widest point, a ceiling that rose to about 9 feet in the center before dropping toward the rear wall, water dripping somewhere deeper with the particular echo of enclosed stone spaces. The smell was cold mineral dust, wet earth, and beneath both something older, the compressed memory of years of still air. She stood inside it for a full minute before she moved, letting her eyes find the geometry of the space, the way a nurse finds the geometry of a body before deciding where to begin. Bramble had not paused at the entrance. The old hound had walked past her into the chamber, circled twice against the eastern wall in a specific area, then lowered herself onto the stone floor and arranged herself with the deliberate economy of an animal that had made a decision. She did not turn to look at Merritt for confirmation. Merritt held the lamp still and let the meaning of that settle. A dog who trusted a place before her owner did was a dog worth listening to. She raised the lamp toward the center of the ceiling and found what she had been hoping to find. Soot trails, dark ribbons leading upward through the stone toward a narrow vertical fissure that disappeared into a darkness above the light's reach. Natural, not engineered, a coincidence of geology that had allowed smoke to escape without filling the space below. She crouched beside the shallow depression in the middle of the floor where old ash and char had accumulated, and she held her palm 3 inches above the darkened stone. Cold, of course. She was not testing temperature. She was testing movement. The faintest drift of air across her palm moved not downward from the fissure above, but upward toward it. The natural convection was doing the work it needed to do. Fire below would push smoke up, not back. She let that fact settle in her chest with the small, hard weight of a good coin. She walked the perimeter twice, working systematically. A stone shelf ran along the northern wall at roughly waist height for about 8 feet, formed by a natural ledge of harder rock that had resisted erosion while the softer material around it wore away. Along the floor, a groove about 4 inches wide angled from the center toward the right rear corner where it disappeared into a low crack near the base of the wall. A drainage channel, old, probably natural in origin, but the edges were too consistent, too aimed to be entirely accidental. Someone had improved it. Someone had lived here long enough to want the meltwater gone. At the back wall, the curve went inward, creating a smaller secondary space that felt distinctly quieter than the main chamber. The air there was drier. She could feel the difference on her lips. When she pressed her palm flat against the stone, it did not carry the killing cold of exterior wood after a full night of below-zero wind. Not warm, not remotely warm, but not hostile the way a cabin wall was hostile in January, actively conducting cold inward against everything inside. She raised the lamp at an angle across the rear wall, and the light caught something she had not seen from the entrance. Marks. Dozens of them, fine lines cut into the stone with something sharp. A knife probably worked carefully against the grain of the rock. They were arranged in loose clusters, each cluster containing 7 marks, the 7th always cut diagonally across the previous 6. She counted 3 full clusters, then partial marks beyond them, then more. Her lamp trembled slightly, and she set the tremble aside without judging it. Weeks. Someone had counted weeks in this cave in the dark, one at a time. Her hand went out and touched the stone beside the marks not on them, and the stone was cold, the way any stone in November is cold, which meant nothing, which meant she was reaching for a warmth that had no reason to have survived. She stood in front of the wall for longer than she meant to. Her lamp lit only her hand, in the rear of the chamber, in the small evidence of another person's persistence, and the rest of the cave was dark behind her. She turned back toward the entrance because thinking about it too long inside the cave would only ferment the question, and because Jonas was going to be home already, and because the money was already spent. $10, the last consolidated sum they possessed. Not savings, because the word savings implied a surplus, and they had none. It was simply the distance between solvent and not, and she had converted it into a water-stained document in Mordecai Pike's handwriting, without asking her husband. And Jonas was a man whose silences had different weights, and the one waiting for her tonight was going to be the heaviest kind. The descent came slow. Ashfall Junction below her looked smaller from the ridge than from inside it, a smear of gray smoke and brown timber. The warehouse roof taller than everything else, the price flag flat in the fading light. She thought about how a thing built to protect people can become the thing that measures them, and she thought about the small, dark shelf of a warehouse office where a ledger recorded every credit transaction in the valley, and she thought about the widow Holcomb and her 3 boys, and about Nora Renfro's cough that had never fully cleared last winter, and she did not slow her step. The cabin was warm when she entered, which meant Jonas had been home an hour or more. He was sitting at the table with his hands resting on the wood in front of him, not working, not eating, simply present in the room in the particular way that confirmed her prediction. The ownership document lay on the table between his broad hands. She had left it there that morning, folded before going to meet Mordecai at the diner. He had found it, read it, formed his understanding of the situation, was now sitting with that understanding the way a man sits with something too large to move quickly. Bramble came in behind her, shook snow from her ears, went to her place near the chimney block, and lowered herself with a sound like a sack of grain. The kettle ticked on the stove. Jonas looked at his hands rather than at his wife, and his voice, when it came, carried none of the volume most men use for a wound that size. $10. Yes. His thumbs moved against the table surface, not tapping, only pressing the way he tested the grain of wood before deciding how to work it. On a cave. On ground with properties a cabin doesn't have. You could have told me. You would have said no. He looked up then, and she had been right about that. The expression was not anger, which would have been easier to navigate. It was something more difficult, the face of a man confronting the specific texture of his own limitations, which was a harder thing to sit across from. His hands were calloused from the forge in a particular pattern, the iron grip callus across the upper palm, the burn mark scars along the right forearm from 20 years of working metal that did not always behave. Those hands had built this cabin, shot every horse in the valley, made the hinges on the church door. They could fabricate almost anything. She unbuttoned her coat and set the lamp on the table. I can't rework the cabin walls this season. No materials, no time before the cold sets proper. He said it before she could. I know, so you found another way. I'm trying to. The pause between them was not new. She had cataloged the vocabulary of his silences for 8 years, and this one was the silence of a man building something in his mind, turning an unfamiliar shape until he found which way it needed to face. She let him have it. She reached instead for the door and pointed at the base of it, where along the floor a thread-like line of snow had sifted inward through the gap between the door and the threshold in the hours since she had left that morning. a fine white fringe that had not been there when she left. The wind outside tonight was moderate. In January, it would be worse by a factor she did not want to calculate precisely. Jonas looked at the snow line for a long time. Then he looked at his hands again. He did not say anything else that evening. The stove ticked. Bramble breathed in her corner. Merritt made cornbread from what was left of the meal and sliced the last of the salt pork thin. Jonas ate what she put in front of him, cleaned his plate, banked the fire, and went to sleep with his back to the wall, in the position she knew meant he was thinking rather than resting. Something in the room had changed its pressure the way the air in a forge changes when the bellows begin. Not the heat yet, only the potential of it. That night she lay in the cold under 2 blankets and thought about the marks on the wall of the cave. And she thought about the widow she had been at 22, and about the way survival had never once been a single decision, but always a chain of small ones. And she thought about Bramble lying now against the chimney block instead of near the stove, choosing radiant heat over convective heat with an animal's practical wisdom. And she thought about the year 1856 that Audley Renfro had mentioned in passing at the general store 2 weeks earlier, when the old widow had made a comment about the cave in a tone that had no laughter in it at all. The cave breathes dry or wet. Audley had not needed to explain the question. Merritt had answered without thinking. Dry enough to sleep, and Audley had nodded with the slow certainty of someone confirming a calculation they had already made internally, and the old woman had pressed 2 jars of peach preserves and a cloth sack of dried mustard seed into Merritt's hands and walked away before gratitude could become a transaction. She had not understood at the time. She was beginning to. She went up the ridge alone before dawn, with a lamp and a pickaxe borrowed from the tool corner of the smithy. Jonas had not stirred when she left, or if he had chosen to let her go without comment. The wind was low. The stars were still out. Bramble padded beside her without instruction. The cave in the pre-dawn dark was a different animal from the cave at midday. Quieter, the fissure above the fire pit almost silent in its convective draw. The drip somewhere in the deep chamber slow enough to count. She worked the drainage channel, first widening the angle toward the rear crack with careful strikes that sent chips of stone into the cold air. The work was slow. The pickaxe was heavier than it needed to be. Her right shoulder had begun a complaint an hour in that she recognized from other winters and disregarded. What mattered was the function of the channel. Water pooling on the floor during a spring thaw would soak whatever it touched and freeze that night into ice, and ice inside a shelter was death dressed in a slower coat. She was fitting stones around the edges of the fire pit, not to contain the fire, but to absorb heat while it burned and hold it after it died when she heard the sound outside. Footsteps on the snow, multiple, deliberate, not attempting to be quiet. Jonas came through the entrance sideways the way she had the first time shoulder turn, carrying 2 river stones, 1 in each hand. Large flat ones she recognized from the creek bed below the forge. He set them down without ceremony, looked at the arrangement she had started around the fire pit, picked up a 3rd stone he had apparently left outside the entrance, and placed it at the position on the eastern side she had not yet reached. It was exactly the right stone for that position, flatter on the bottom than the others, which would give it better contact with the ground. He did not explain his presence. He did not ask permission. He began working in the space that needed work with the competence of a man who understood materials in the economy, of a man who had decided something privately and saw no reason to make a speech about it. They worked side by side for 4 hours without exchanging more than functional information. That stone goes there. This one's too round to stack. The drainage cut wants to angle left or it'll pull at the crook. By midday, the fire pit had a proper ring of heat-absorbing stone, and the floor drainage was clean and clear. Jonas had used his forge hammer, which he had brought in a sack over his shoulder, to break 2 problematic rock protrusions from the floor that would have complicated bed frame placement later. When they descended in the afternoon, Bramble ran ahead of them, both already knowing the route. Jonas walked beside her down the slope without speaking, his breath clouding in the cold air, the empty sack over his shoulder. At the point where the trail split toward town and toward the cabin, he stopped and she stopped, and he said only what needed saying. "The chimney fissure. You tested the draft direction. It's running the right way." She nodded once. It was not an argument. It was not a concession. It was the first sentence in a language they had not yet learned to share, and she recognized it because she had been listening for it. He turned toward the cabin trail and she watched his broad back go the familiar set of his shoulders, the particular way he walked that she had learned to read, the same way she had learned to read the cave's airflow. Something in him was recalibrating. She could not have named exactly what. She followed him home. Over the next 4 days, the cave took the shape she had been carrying in her head for 2 months. On the third day, she built a frame for the sleeping platform from scavenged planks she had pulled from an abandoned freight shed on the north edge of Asphalt Junction, one that had belonged to a hauling company that folded when the railroad Hope died in the spring of '79. The planks were rough but sound. She raised the platform 14 inches above the cave floor, high enough that the cold radiating upward from the stone could not pull heat from sleeping bodies by direct conduction, low enough that the ceiling still cleared. Jonas, without being asked, fabricated iron bracket connectors for the platform joints during a quiet hour at the smithy, and he brought them up the next morning, fitted them without requiring instruction, and by afternoon the platform was solid enough to stand on with both feet and jump without any give. He ran his hand along the joint where the iron met the wood in the way craftsmen acknowledge good fit. Not praise, only recognition. The canvas curtains required careful planning. She acquired 2 lengths of heavy canvas from the dry goods section of the general store, paying cash, which drew a look from the clerk that she noted without addressing, and she spent an evening cutting and patching them into 2 separate panels, each large enough to cover the cave entrance with overlap on all sides. The critical detail was the gap she left 8 inches of air between the 2 panels when hung, creating a dead air buffer zone that would break the wind's momentum before it reached the main chamber. A single thick curtain would block more wind than nothing, but would ice over and stiffen. 2 panels with a gap between them would stay flexible and would not conduct cold from outer surface to inner surface. Jonas fabricated the hanging rods, 2 of them mounted at different depths in the entrance passage. He did it in one session at the forge, delivered them up the ridge late on the 4th afternoon, and installed them with plugs driven into drilled holes in the rock face. The work was efficient. The rods were straight. The mounting was solid. That evening was the first time they sat together inside the finished entrance arrangement, and she noticed that neither of them pointed out what they had made. They simply sat with it. The lamp between them, bramble against the eastern wall, the curtains filtering the outside air into something the main chamber could manage. The draft is cut by about 2/3. The words were not for Jonas. They were for herself, spoken aloud, because speaking made a thing real. He turned his head toward the curtain edge, where a faint cold breath still moved in near the stone face. I can pack the perimeter gap with split pine wedges. Force the air through the fabric instead of around it. That would help. He did it the next morning. The fire was her most significant failure, and she needed to fail it to understand it properly. On the 5th day, she built a fire that was too large. Not by much. She had exercised real restraint compared to what she might have built on a night like that, with the temperature outside dropping and the stone walls radiating cold back at her from storage. The fire was ambitious, not reckless. For several minutes, it was exactly what the cave seemed to need, bright hot, reaching toward the chimney fissure with intent. Then the smoke changed direction. It did not curl upward gradually. It inverted sharply, rolling down from the ceiling in a thick gray-black layer that spread across the chamber with alarming speed. The physics were straightforward and unforgiving. The fire had created too strong a convection column too quickly, and the air rushing up through the fissure had created a low-pressure zone that pulled cold outside air down through the same channel faster than the fire could counteract it. The smoke had nowhere to go but back. She killed the fire in under 2 minutes. Dirt first, then the water bucket she kept near the entrance, then her boot heel on the remaining embers. The cave went dark except for the lamp. Outside, the wind moved through the ridge above them with the indifferent sound it had always made, unaware of what it had just done to her planning. She sat in the dark beside the cold ash for a long time. Failure was information. Failure that killed nobody was cheap information. She would not waste it by feeling humiliated. She lit a single candle, a taper barely enough to read direction by, and she moved it to different positions above the fire pit, 12 inches above it at the perimeter of the flame position at the edge of the stone ring. She watched what the tiny flame did with the patience she had learned from wound assessment, which required a person to look at what was actually there, rather than what she expected to find. Small errors in wound assessment killed people. Small errors in draft management would produce the same result more slowly. Near midnight, the answer arrived, and it was the same answer Ottilie Renfro had given her in a different language 2 weeks earlier. People freeze because they keep trying to heat air instead of protecting warmth. The cave did not need a large fire, ever. It needed a smaller one and a longer one, hours of modest flame that loaded the stone ring gradually so that the stones themselves became the heat source after the fire lowered. The chimney fissure needed the fire placed slightly forward of center, not at the geometric middle of the pit, to align the convection column with the fissure's angle. The difference was perhaps 8 inches. 8 inches was the distance between the cave filling with smoke and the cave breathing correctly. 8 inches was the entire lesson. She heard Jonas's boot on the stone behind her. She did not turn around. He came and sat beside her, without asking what she was doing, in the way he had learned to sit over 8 years of marriage, understanding that she was working and that the work required something from him beyond questions. He stayed for perhaps 20 minutes. Then he set something beside her on the floor and stood. She looked down. A tin cup of cold coffee from the morning's pot brought from home in his coat pocket. He had walked up the dark ridge in the middle of the night to bring her cold coffee. She picked up the cup. He went back down the ridge. She sat with the candle until she was certain she understood what she was dealing with. The supply problem had its own arithmetic, and she managed it the way she had managed harder arithmetic in years no one paid her to remember. For 2 weeks before the cave purchase, she had been working behind the assay office on a contract basis, not assaying which required equipment she did not own, but maintaining the records that the assay office generated, tallying weights, cross-referencing sample numbers against the logbook entries. It was the kind of work assay offices perpetually needed and perpetually underpaid, because the men who ran them believed that work involving paper and numbers was inherently less demanding than work involving hammers. She accepted the pay in cash. She counted it every night at the table while Jonas sat across from her with the smithy accounts. Rendered hog fat at 10 cents a pound, barley at 15, lamp oil, rope, coil, salt, brick. The numbers on the supply list and the numbers in her coin pile were not identical, and the gap between them required management. Rutherford Cade noticed the purchasing pattern by the 5th day. She had expected him to. A man who ran the primary supply operation in a small and economically depressed community developed an acute sensitivity to unusual purchasing behavior. It was essentially the same skill as threat detection, only expressed through inventory. He stopped her outside the warehouse on the 5th day of her supply runs, one hand resting on the ledger he kept mounted on a nail beside the door, the ledger that recorded every credit transaction in the valley. Rutherford Cade was 55 years old and had the quality of a man who had always been 55 years old, settled into authority so completely it was impossible to imagine him having been young or uncertain or dependent on anyone for anything. His eyes were gray and measuring the eyes of someone for whom all human interaction was fundamentally a transaction to be evaluated. He looked at the sled load and then at her, and his voice carried the practiced warmth of a man who used warmth strategically. Planning for war. She tightened the rope on the barley sack. Planning for weather. He smiled. The smile did not reach the gray eyes. Interesting distinction. He let his hand rest on the ledger a moment longer than the gesture required. Every family in this valley has an account here. Flour, nails, lamp oil, winter credit. It works because everyone participates in the same system. A woman buying supplies outside the system tends to disrupt the accounting, or simplifies it by requiring fewer entries. She picked up the sled rope and left him standing with the ledger. She did not look back, but she was aware in the precise way the field hospital years had made her aware of people who represented potential complications, that Rutherford Cade was now watching her with something more than amusement. That night, walking up to the cave to store the day's supplies, she found a sack beside the sled. Clean, dry salt carefully wrapped against moisture. No note, no explanation. She crouched beside it, examined the knot, assessed the quality of the wrapping. Fresh boot prints in the snow led back downhill toward town. Small boots, woman's size. She looked up toward the warehouse where a single lamp burned in an upper window. A shape stood at the glass, partially lit. Then the shape stepped back from the light and the window went dark. Merritt studied the space where the figure had been for a moment. Then she lifted the salt sack onto her sled and continued up the ridge in the dark. On the 6th day, she met Ephraim Voss. She had seen the tracks earlier in the week, fresh boot prints in the snow above the cave entrance, leading from somewhere higher on the eastern slope. She had noted them the way she noted most things, without immediate action, without forgetting. The tracks had appeared twice, both times before dawn, and on the second occasion there had been a small stack of dry juniper wood beside the cave mouth, split to a useful size, alongside a rabbit snare repaired with new wire. Bramble followed the tracks on the sixth morning head low, moving with directional certainty upslope to the east. Merritt followed the dog. 20 minutes above the cave entrance, tucked into a shelf of rock, barely distinguishable from the landscape, until you were close enough to see the smoke trail from the stovepipe, was a cabin barely large enough to be called that. It had the look of something built by a man who had stopped caring about appearances, but had not stopped caring about function. Ephraim was sitting outside in the cold, working on a piece of cordwood with a small hatchet, and he looked up at her approach without surprise. He was 60 years old in the way certain men were 60, not old exactly, but thorough, worn into final form. His face was creased deeply around the eyes from years of squinting into mine shafts with inadequate lamplight. His hands, she noted, had the same callous pattern her father's had, men who had spent decades working stone. He had been a mining hand at the iron kettle dig in the late 60s. He told her 20 years on this ridge, in and out of various shafts, knew every fold and face of the rock from here to the eastern summit. The cave she had bought, he had known it since his second season. He had taken refuge in it in the winter of '71, when a collapsed access shaft had cut him off from the camp for 3 months in November. He had gone in with 2 weeks of food and no alternative. He led her back down to the cave, ducked through the entrance with the ease of long familiarity, and walked her to the rear wall where the knife marks clustered. He pressed his palm against the stone between the marks, the way you place a hand on something you had been relieved to find still standing. His voice, when it came, was quiet and did not carry the theatrical weight some men use for their own difficult stories. 1 mark every week. I counted so I wouldn't lose track. Time does something strange when you're in the dark that long. His eyes moved along the marks, slowly visiting each cluster. Then his gaze went toward the deeper darkness beyond the secondary chamber, where the cave continued another 30 feet before ending in solid rock. It kept me warm enough. It kept me alive. A pause the size of a breath, but it kept the loneliness just as well. She looked at the marks and said nothing. She was counting them. 84. There were more than she had initially estimated. 3 months roughly. He had been in this cave for 3 months in the winter of '71 alone, counting weeks on a wall. He showed her 3 things she had not found on her own. A secondary air pocket near the rear wall ceiling that would allow her to store temperature-sensitive items in a slightly warmer microenvironment. A crack in the eastern wall that channeled ground seep away from the main chamber during spring melt. The angle of the stone floor, almost imperceptible to the eye but real when measured, that drained toward the existing channel rather than pooling at the sleeping end. When he left, he walked back up the slope toward his cabin without looking back. He had delivered what he had come to deliver. She stood alone in the cave with the lamp after he had gone. She looked at the 3 months of knife marks on the rear wall, and then at the space she had spent 6 days converting: the stone ring, the raised platform, the curtained entrance, the storage shelves above the floor where moisture moved slowest. The smoked venison strips hung along the northern face. She had bought something that looked worthless and had been spending the week since making it visible. Outside, the wind picked up across the ridge face. Not dramatically, not dangerously, but noticeably. The sound of it moved through the rock above and came back changed, slightly lower in pitch, the way wind sounded when it was pulling cold from somewhere far north and bringing it south without apology. Bramble against the eastern wall did not raise her head, but she shifted her body another 6 inches deeper into the chamber without opening her eyes. Merritt did not need to check the sky to know what that meant. She had been reading signs long enough to trust them. She picked up the lamp, turned it down to conserve oil, and began planning for what was coming. She went down to Asphalt Junction that afternoon while the light still held. She walked into Halvard's without removing her coat, and she stood near the entrance while the room sorted itself into its usual groupings. Silas Thorne by the stove with 2 men from the North Road camp. Rutherford Cade in his corner with the ledger open. Reverend Alden Booth near the window with his habitual expression of concerned benevolence. She did not sit down. She waited until the conversation had a natural gap, and then she filled it with one sentence: "Split more wood before Sunday." The room went quiet for perhaps 2 seconds. Then the looks came. Not hostile exactly. Something less direct and more durable than hostility. The look people direct at someone they have decided to be patient with. Silas set his coffee down and turned in his chair with the relaxed ease of a man who had the room at his back. "You're hiding from Winter Underground now." She looked at him without expression. "No." Her eyes moved toward the north-facing window, where the glass had the faint gray opacity of cold glass struggling against outside pressure, hiding from wind. One of the men near Silas chuckled into his cup. Reverend Booth cleared his throat and began saying something about how every winter made men uneasy, which was the kind of sentence that wanted to smooth things over without committing to anything. Merritt glanced toward the north-facing window one more time. The sky through the glass had gone the color of old lead. Not storm color exactly, but the color of the hour before storm color when the atmosphere was still deciding. Not this one. She walked back out into the gray afternoon. The door swung shut behind her. Through the glass, the lamplight inside the diner continued its warm, certain business, and the men continued their conversation, and the stovepipe continued its occasional tick of expanding metal. In the corner, Rutherford Cade had not laughed. He closed his ledger slowly, with the deliberate care of a man filing something away for later reference, and he watched the door for a long moment after she had gone. That night, long after the last lamp went dark in the warehouse, 3 families received notice by hand delivery that their outstanding credit balances were due in 48 hours rather than at the end of the month. The Wrens, the Renfros, the widow Holcomb. Rutherford Cade's handwriting on each notice was precise and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who considered himself to be doing something entirely reasonable. He would call it protecting inventory. He would call it good business. He would not call it what it was, which was the deliberate compression of 3 households against a wall he could see coming down the mountain, so that when the wall arrived, they would have nothing left to trade but land, and he would be the only man in the valley with the standing supplies to buy it cheap. Nobody in Ashfall Junction knew about the notices until morning. By then, Merritt was already up the ridge checking the curtain fastenings by lamplight, while Bramble lay against the eastern wall with her nose pointed toward the cave entrance and her eyes open in the dark. The northern sky, when Merritt stepped out to look at it just before dawn, had deepened from lead to something closer to pewter, heavier, lower, pressing down on the ridgetops with a deliberate weight that had not been there the evening before. The wind from the north smelled of distance, not of the local cold, not the familiar Wyoming cold she knew in her fingers and her collar, but of something that had been traveling for a long time and had not yet decided where to stop. She went back inside. She checked the bean count, the fat tins, the lamp oil. She ran her hand along the stone ring around the fire pit. The stones were cold. They needed hours of careful fire to reach their working temperature. She had the wood. She had the patience. What she did not yet have was certainty about the timing. Bramble answered that question. The old hound stood up from the eastern wall, walked to the center of the chamber, and lowered herself again, facing the entrance. Her ears were fully forward. Her body was completely still. Merritt built the fire small and deliberate, the way she had tested it, with the candle forward of center, aligned with the fissure above. The smoke went straight up and did not return. She fed the fire carefully through the remaining dark hours, one piece of juniper at a time, watching the stones begin their slow, patient work of collecting heat. Outside, the wind had started making a sound against the ridge she had not heard before from this elevation. Not the usual wind sound, lower, longer, with a metallic resonance that came through the stone walls rather than around them. The mountain was listening to something she could not see yet. She listened with it, and she thought of the $10 she had spent, and she thought of the widow she had been at 22, sitting on a bench in a Union Hospital corridor, after Appomattox, with no home to return to and no name on any pay roster. And she thought about how the difference between getting through a bad night and not had never once in her whole life been about how much a person owned. It had always been about what a person had prepared while there was still time to prepare. The lamp on the shelf burned steady. Bramble did not move. And somewhere out beyond the ridge, coming down out of the north with the indifferent momentum of weather that has already decided, the storm gathered itself and began to walk. The oil lamp on the stone shelf tilted its flame sideways at an angle that had no explanation in the physical conditions of the chamber. No draft had shifted. The curtain panels behind her hung motionless. The flame simply leaned hard to the left, as though something outside the cave had decided to reach through solid rock to move it. Merritt watched the lean without moving, the way she had once watched a patient's pupil, to see whether it would respond. Bramble was already on her feet, ears vertical, body locked into the specific stillness that was the opposite of calm. The mountain answered the lean a moment later. A deep, metallic roar came up through the cave floor before it came through the air, as though the ridge had been struck by something enormous from above. It had no beginning and no decay. It established itself as the new baseline of the world outside and remained there, constant building and register rather than diminishing. Jonas looked up from a harness strap he had been repairing by lamplight, having taken to bringing small work up to the cave in the evenings, which was its own kind of statement made without words. He watched Bramble for the length of a slow breath, the way a man cross-references what he is seeing against what he believed possible. Merritt was at the curtain panels before the sound fully resolved. She separated them 2 inches at the seam where they overlapped and looked out into the entrance passage. Beyond the outer panel, the world had stopped being composed of distinct objects. Snow was not falling. It was moving laterally in a mass so dense it functioned more like a fluid than a precipitation. The rock face 10 feet from the cave entrance had become a gray-white abstraction. The sledge she had left anchored existed only as a vague interruption in the horizontal flow. She let the curtain fall back into place. The seam sealed. The chamber was immediately quieter, which measured the gap she had built, the difference between the noise outside and the noise inside. Real substantial something her hands had made over 6 days that was now doing its work. She stood in the center of the space and listened to the fire in its pit forward of center at the 8-inch offset she had calculated by candlelight 2 nights before. The stone ring around it had been loading heat for 4 hours. The air in the main chamber was dry still, at least 40 degrees warmer than the air against the entrance curtain. No rushing draft crossed the floor. No freezing crosswind moved at ankle height the way it moved in every cabin in the valley when outside temperatures dropped and the walls began conducting cold inward with the indifference of poor construction. The cave had not flinched. That frightened her in a specific way, the fear that arrives not when things are going badly, but when a person realizes how much worse they are going somewhere else. Jonas was already calculating. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his eyes moved between the fire, the supply shelves, the curtain, assessing the system he had helped build with the same professional habit he applied to any structure under load. His voice when it came was level, genuine inquiry rather than concern dressed as a question. How long can the stone hold heat if we stop feeding the fire? 3 hours at full load. Maybe 4 if we add 2 more pieces before banking it. He picked up 2 lengths of juniper from the stack, positioned them at the edges of the fire with the precision of someone who understood heat distribution through direct material experience, then sat back down. The fire did not flare. It adjusted, deepened the kind of combustion interested in longevity rather than spectacle. Outside, something large gave way in the valley below. The sound reached them muffled through rock and snow, a structural collapse, a roof or a wall, something that had been holding against forces it was never designed to accommodate. Then another. Then a silence that was not silence, because the wind underneath everything did not pause. Had not paused since it arrived, showed no indication of understanding what pausing meant. Merritt sat beside the low fire for a long time that first night without sleeping, listening to the storm test every weakness it could locate in the mountain above them. The cave found none for it to grip. The information pointed directly down the ridge toward Ashfall Junction, and it pointed at every family that had not prepared for what the sky had brought down. Ephraim Voss arrived at dawn of the second day, which meant he had come down from his cabin in the dark, in the full force of the storm, without a lamp. He came through the curtain panels with snow compacted into every fold of his coat, his beard crusted with ice along the lower half, his boots leaving wet prints that began melting immediately on the cave floor. He stood inside the entrance and looked at the chamber with the expression of a man arriving somewhere he already knew, which was what it was for him. His voice was thickened by cold, and by something older than cold, Roof started singing. He brushed ice from his beard with fingers that moved stiffly, the tendons having taken in the temperature. He looked at the fire, the stone ring, the platform. You finished what I couldn't do that winter. He settled against the western wall without ceremony and accepted the cup of warmed water Merritt brought him. Jonas watched this without comment. The 2 men took each other's measure the way men do when they are both accustomed to being the competent one in a given space. Ephraim was 60, Jonas was 38. Neither had obvious precedents. They established a functional distribution within the hour, built around the shared work of keeping the fire properly loaded, which required judgment both possessed, and neither wanted to delegate. It was not competition avoided, it was competition never entered. The second day was the longest day Merritt had known since the summer of 1863, not because of anything that happened, but because of the quality of the waiting. The storm's absolute refusal to communicate any information about its own duration pressing against the mountain with the same force at noon it had used at midnight, giving nothing away about what it intended. She kept the fire at the level that maintained the stones without overloading the chimney. She checked the curtain panels twice for ice accumulation at the lower edges. She inventoried the supplies with care not because the numbers had changed, but because maintaining an accurate count was the kind of discipline that prevented the small errors of optimism that killed people in extended emergencies. She did not assume she had more than she had. She counted every time and accepted the number she found. Ottilie Renfro was already half buried when Merritt spotted her. The shape appeared below the ridgeline at midday, visible through a momentary thinning in the horizontal snow, a dark mass in the wrong position, too low, too still for someone in motion. Merritt watched it for 3 seconds while the visual data resolved. Then she was moving before she had completed the sentence she was saying to herself about what she was looking at. Bramble went through the curtain panels ahead of her without being told. The cold outside hit with a completeness that the cave had made her temporarily forget was possible. It was not merely cold, it was cold with mass. Cold that pushed back, that had physical intentions regarding the heat inside a human body and was not interested in negotiation. The wind at ground level hit her at an angle that felt structural, as though the air itself had become a wall that was intermittently deciding to move sideways. Ottilie had gotten within 40 yards of the cave entrance before she had fallen. She was on her side in a hollow between two rock formations, partially shielded from the direct wind, which had probably been the only thing keeping her from being pushed further down the slope. Her right glove had frozen to the rock she had grabbed when she fell, fusing fabric to stone in the way extreme cold welds contact surfaces without permission. Bramble was licking her face, moving between sharp whines, pressing the full weight of her body against the old woman's torso. Not comfort. The dog was applying heat directly, efficiently. Getting Ottilie up the slope was a different calculation than Merritt had expected. The woman was 70 pounds lighter than she looked, which turned out to be a problem rather than an advantage because it meant the wind had more relative effect on her, pushed her off balance, and the gust that came every 90 seconds or so was hard enough to send her sideways. Merritt had one arm Bramble was pressing from behind, and the 40 yards to the entrance took longer than she was willing to measure precisely, because measuring it precisely would have required acknowledging how close certain margins were. Jonas appeared at the entrance at the moment she needed him most without her having called, without any communication she could account for. He simply materialized, coat on, no lamp, reading the situation in the second it took him to clear the curtain. He took Ottilie's other side, and the remaining distance became manageable. Inside, Ephraim began the practical work of removing the frozen outer layers without causing secondary damage. He had done field emergency care in mining contexts and knew the sequence. Jonas moved toward the fire, instinctively reaching to increase it. Merritt's hand came out slow, and he stopped, and he looked at her. She was already kneeling beside Ottilie, fingers on the pulse point below the jaw. Rapid rewarming can stop a heart that's been cold for that long. Warm water progressively, not fire heat. Jonas moved to the water bucket without another word. He did not explain himself to himself about this. She could see that in the absence of any hesitation or resentment. He simply redirected. It was a different thing than agreement, which would have implied having considered an alternative. He had stopped treating his wife's medical knowledge as opinion competing with instinct. He had begun treating it as information, the same way he treated the grain of wood or the temper of steel. Ottilie came back in increments. Consciousness returned the way warmth returned to cold stone, unevenly from the interior outward, with pockets of awareness preceding the complete picture. Her eyes opened without full comprehension, closed, opened again, with more purchase on what she was looking at. When she finally sat up enough to see the full chamber, the fire, the arranged supply shelves, the stone platform, the system of it, the unmistakable evidence of deliberate preparation. Tears gathered at the outer edges of her eyes, without her face making any other movement. Her voice, when it came, was barely at speaking volume. "You built a winter's stomach under the mountain." She was addressing Jonas, Merritt noted, crediting the construction to the man who had come late, who had worked without acknowledgement, who had put iron brackets on a platform he had not believed in. Jonas received this with an expression that was not pride and was not embarrassment, but was something between them, the face of a man being seen doing something right by someone whose estimation he had not known he valued. The condensation problem announced itself on the third night. Ottilie found it first watching the cave ceiling from her position on the platform, with the alert, systematic observation of a woman who had survived enough winters to know the next problem was always somewhere she was not currently looking. A thin layer of ice had formed above the sleeping corner, almost invisible against the stone, a crystalline film that caught the lamplight at the right angle and revealed itself as a sheen where there should have been dry rock. Bramble abandoned her sleeping position against the eastern wall and moved toward the fire with a low guttural sound that was not quite a growl and not quite complaint, but occupied the frequency between them. Merritt was on her feet before the dog settled. The problem was thermodynamic. Warm, moist air from the fire rose to meet cold stone in the upper chamber. Condensation formed on the ceiling surface. The thin layer of water froze as the fire lowered at night. By morning, the warmer air from the rebuilt fire would begin melting it. Cold drops onto the sleeping surface. Prolonged exposure to intermittent cold water in a person already depleted by days of stress was not a management problem. It was a mortality problem. She walked the ceiling with the lamp mapping the affected area, perhaps 6 feet of surface, directly above the sleeping platform's far end. Jonas appeared beside her without being summoned. Lamp raised to match hers, both of them reading the ceiling. He said nothing for a full minute, working through the geometry of it. Then his voice low, certain the voice he used when the answer had arrived and was waiting only to be spoken. Move the platform north 3 feet. Gets it out from under the problem zone. That puts the head end under the secondary vent. Better cold air from above than cold water from above. She considered it. He was right. The calculation favored the draft risk over the drip risk because the draft could be managed with blanket positioning in a way the drip could not. There's a second piece. The vent opening needs to be narrowed to reduce air exchange volume overnight. Less warm air reaching that ceiling zone means less source moisture. He was already moving toward the tool corner before she finished. The platform relocation took 90 minutes in the middle of the night, working by lamp with Ephraim holding the frame sections, while Jonas and Merritt repositioned the supports. Ottilie sat against the wall and held the light steady, without being asked, understanding instinctively that the most useful thing she could do was not participate in the physical work. Jonas chiseled the vent opening narrower with 4 precise strikes that produced less noise than she had expected from a man working stone in the middle of the night. His hands knew how to hit something hard without violence. She watched his back while he worked and thought about how long it had taken them both to reach a collaboration that looked this simple from the outside. When they finished, he pressed his palm flat against the relocated platform surface, feeling for cold conduction from the floor through the new support positions. He adjusted 1 foot placement by 2 inches. Then he stood. His eyes found hers over the lamp. He put his hand on her shoulder 1 second, then removed it. In 8 years of marriage, she had cataloged the vocabulary of his silences, and this one meant something specific he would never say directly, which was that he understood now what she had been building. She turned back to check the water buckets. The fire needed another piece of juniper. There was always another piece of juniper. Hollis Wren arrived on the 4th day with Junia against his chest, and the sound of him at the curtain was different from Ephraim's arrival. Faster, less controlled. The sound of someone who had been moving as quickly as the conditions allowed for longer than was sustainable. He came through with both panels of canvas wrapping around him, simultaneously unable to manage the layered entrance, with his arms full, pulling the outer panel off its lower mount on one side. Jonas had the panel remounted within 10 minutes. Nobody mentioned this. Junia was 8 years old, wrapped in 2 quilts that had frozen together at the outer surfaces into a single stiff shell. The color at her lips was wrong, not blue exactly, more the blue-adjacent shade Merritt associated with particular stages of cold exposure that required immediate measured response. The girl's breathing was shallow, regular enough to indicate the heart was maintaining, but nothing beyond that could be assumed. Hollis had held her the whole way up the ridge in the storm because he needed something to hold. He stood inside the cave with snow falling from him in chunks and watched Merritt work with the suspended attention of a person who has placed everything they have in a single location. She understood the shape of his coat before he told her. She had seen it in the general store in October, and now she saw what had been done to it since. His right elbow had been patched with a scrap of hide too small for the tear. His boots were worn at the heel in the manner of leather that had already been resoled twice and could not be resoled again. This was the coat of one of the 3 families Rutherford Cade had squeezed to the wall before the sky came down. He had run out of lamp oil on the second night. He had been rationing wood since the fourth day. He had waited too long to move because moving required admitting a thing he had not been ready to admit. The cave's stored heat was doing its first real work. Not the fire, the stones. The air temperature in the main chamber had dropped slightly over the past hour as the fire had lowered, but the stone ring continued radiating at a steady, gentle level that kept the ambient temperature from crashing. Merritt positioned Junia's wrapped form near the stone ring, not touching it 18 inches away, inside the warm layer of air that radiated outward from the heat-loaded rock. She set two heated stones pulled from the ring's outer edge, where they had been loading for hours, wrapped them in dry cloth, placed them against the outside of the quilts at the torso level. Not hot. She tested the temperature against her own forearm first. Warm. The sustained kind. Bramble lowered herself full length against Junia's back, adding her own body temperature to the available sources. The old hound did this without instruction and without hesitation, with the calm deliberateness of an animal who knew exactly what her body was for. Merritt monitored pulse and breathing on a 10-minute cycle. The numbers moved in the right direction slowly, which was the only acceptable direction for this kind of recovery. Too fast was dangerous. The right rate was almost imperceptibly gradual, like the cave's own heat transfer patient built from stored capacity rather than sudden input. 2 hours later, the first real pink returned to Junia's lips. It came in unevenly, the corners first, then spreading toward the center, the color filling in the way color fills a drawing. Hollis had not moved from his position beside his daughter in those 2 hours. He had not spoken. When the color came back, he exhaled a breath that contained something larger than air. He looked at Merritt across the lamp, his voice stripped of everything except what was left, after 2 hours of being unable to help. I left a bundle of pitchwood beside your sled. October. After the diner. I didn't sign it. Merritt was checking Junia's fingertip color, not looking up. I know. He was quiet for a moment. How? 'Cause nobody else in Ashfall Junction believed enough to do a thing quietly. Acts done without an audience are rare. They narrow the list. She moved to the next finger. He looked at the fire for a long time. Silas Thorne arrived on the 5th day carrying Elias through waist-deep snow, and the carpenter was a large man moving through conditions that made size irrelevant. The wind did not respect width any more than it respected reputation, and Ashfall Junction's respect for Silas Thorne did not extend to meteorological phenomena. He came through the curtain panels with the controlled desperation of a man who had waited too long to make a decision and was now carrying the physical cost of that delay in his arms. Elias was 7, coughing with the wet, settled sound of a chest that had been breathing smoke-thick air for days. Their cabin chimney had iced shut on the second night of the storm, and instead of seeking alternative shelter, they had waited in the way people wait when they have a high opinion of their own ability to endure and a low opinion of alternatives that require admitting they had been wrong. The coughing filled the chamber when Elias arrived. It was the loudest sound the cave had held since the storm began, louder than the storm itself. At that distance, a child's body working urgently to clear passages that needed time and warmth and clean air rather than urgency. Merritt wrapped heated blankets around the boy near the fire. Bramble moved from her position beside Junia without hesitation and settled against Elias's side, thick fur pressed against the shaking body. She seemed to understand that warmth was a mobile resource she was responsible for deploying where it was most needed. Silas stood in the center of the chamber and looked at it. Looked at it the way a carpenter looks at joinery better than his own. Not with envy exactly, but with the specific focus of someone whose professional identity is built on competence, encountering competence he had not predicted. The raised platform, the stone heat system, the double curtain he had just come through, which had broken the wind's momentum so completely that the main chamber behind it felt almost separated from the storm by something more substantial than canvas. The food shelves positioned above floor height, the drainage channel cutting cleanly toward the rear wall. Every element was doing something. Nothing was decorative. He looked at Merritt for a long moment. She was arranging a heated stone beside Elias's blanket without looking at him. When his voice came, it was not loud, not performative. It was the voice of a man saying something directly because the alternative was to carry it. I laughed at this place. Merritt positioned the stone, checked its temperature against her wrist. I know. Nothing followed that. No speech, no return of the laughter's worth, no collected interest on the debt. She had not built the cave for that, and she had no use for his regret beyond the fact of it. He had said it. The record existed. What he did next was his own business. Barnaby Crail arrived that same evening with Tobias, and trouble arrived with them as naturally as weather arrives with a front. Barnaby was built for hauling wide through the chest, thick in the forearms, the kind of physical presence that had always been enough to resolve most situations before they required actual resolution. He occupied the cave the way he occupied every space as though he had been there first. Within an hour of arrival, he had rearranged his position twice each time, selecting the spot that required the most people to adjust around him. The first evening's meal with a full chamber was the first real test of the rationing system. Merritt measured the pinto beans by the same method she had used since the storm began: weight, not volume, because settled beans lied about quantity in ways that weight did not. Equal portions by body weight would have favored Barnaby's argument, which he understood, but it would have created a sliding scale impossible to maintain fairly as occupancy changed. Equal flat portions kept the system legible, which meant it could be defended and understood by everyone in the chamber. Barnaby stared at the amount in his tin cup with an expression that progressed from assessment through displeasure into something closer to grievance as he watched smaller people receive the same measure. His voice was aimed at the fire rather than at anyone specifically, which was the particular cowardice of complaints wanting to register without technically being directed, "I'm bigger than half this cave." Nobody answered. The fire cracked. Shadows crossed the walls. He stood up hard enough to scrape his boot across the stone floor, raising a small cloud of dust. "I work harder than most people in this room put together. I eat more." He took a step toward the supply shelf that was not quite a step toward Merritt, but was arranged to feel like one. Jonas was on his feet, not quickly, not with the urgency of someone reacting, with the deliberate pace of a man who had made a decision before he stood, who stood because the decision required him to be vertical. He placed himself between Barnaby and the shelf, without touching Barnaby, without raising his voice, without any of the physical signals that preceded violence in the men Merritt had seen violence from. He simply occupied the space Barnaby had been moving into, the way a properly fitted door occupies a frame. The two men held that position long enough for everyone in the chamber to understand what was being decided. Silas had shifted his weight. Ephraim had lifted his eyes from the fire. Hollis had put his hand on Junia without looking at her, the instinctive parental move of a man preparing for something uncertain. Then Tobias spoke from the rear wall where he had been sitting apart from his father since they arrived. The boy was 16, with his father's build beginning to assert itself in his shoulders, but not yet in his bearing. He held his untouched bowl in both hands. His voice was level low, the voice of someone who had decided on the words in advance because they were too important to improvise. "Papa, sit down." The word "papa" was one Tobias had used when he was small and had left behind years ago in the ordinary way boys leave things behind when trying to look like men in front of their fathers. It surfaced now under pressure in the way language stored deeper than habit surfaces when everything else has been stripped away. The shame on the boy's face was not the shame of embarrassment. It was the specific shame of someone who loves a person and can see exactly what that person is doing wrong. It was a more complicated grief than embarrassment, and it had been building for longer than this cave. Barnaby looked at his son for 5 full seconds. The calculation happening behind his eyes was not about beans or portions or Jonas's position in the space. It was about what his son saw when he looked at his father and whether that image was something he could continue to ignore. He sat down. Jonas returned to his place beside the fire. Ephraim lowered his eyes. Hollis's hand moved from Junia's shoulder. The cave was quiet except for the fire, the distant sound of the storm against the ridge, Elias's breathing from the sleeping platform, still rough, but improving the wet quality, leaving it hour by hour. Later in the deep watch of that night, Tobias moved his sleeping position from beside his father to the space near Junia and Bramble at the platform's edge. He did not explain this. He simply moved quietly in the dark, the way people move when they are choosing something they do not yet have language for. Delphine. Cade knocked on the 5th night, 3 deliberate strikes against the timber post at the entrance, measured, not desperate, the careful signal of someone who had thought about what she was doing before she did it. Merritt opened the entrance panel. Delphine was standing in the passage with a flour sack across one shoulder, 2 glass jars wrapped against her coat with one arm. Frost on her eyelashes so thick it had begun to change the shape of them. One side of her face had gone pale, in the specific way that indicated blood had retreated from the surface tissue on the windward side. Not frostbite yet, not quite, but close enough that the distance was measured in minutes rather than miles. Bramble stepped back from the entrance without being told. Several people in the chamber noticed this. The dog's opinion of people was not neutral, and her opinion of Delphine Cade was apparently favorable enough to make space for her immediately. Delphine moved to the supply shelf and set down the flour sack with the careful deliberateness of someone who has carried something valuable across a difficult distance. The glass jars followed, pine resin cough syrup with wild honey visible through the glass, the kind made by someone who knew medicine by practice, rather than reading the kind that had been prepared over hours in a small room above a dry goods counter for a purpose the maker had been building toward without naming. Jonas looked at what was in the jars, the way he looked at precision work. He understood, without being told what it had cost, to make something that specific in preparation for a need that was not the maker's own. Delphine stood facing the fire while thawed snow ran off her coat sleeves in thin streams. Her back was to most of the chamber. When she spoke, she was addressing no one specifically, but the words were for everyone. My father has flour under the warehouse floorboards. Salt pork, beans, lamp oil. He's been storing it there since September. She paused. The fire did not move. He told the widow Holcomb her credit was cut. Same for the Renfros. Same for the Wrens. 3 days before this came down. Nobody responded immediately. The cave absorbed this the way the stone absorbed heat, taking it in, holding it, distributing it slowly through everything connected to it. Then she said the sentence she had been building toward the one she had practiced, and then tried to unpractice because saying it out loud made it permanent. He caught me in the storeroom tonight, said if I walked out that door I shouldn't come back. A breath. I walked out. The fire cracked once, a small explosive report from a knot in the juniper. Merritt crossed the chamber without hurry. She put her arms around Delphine and held her there, not urgently, not with the performance of comfort, simply with the full quiet weight of another person choosing to be present at the moment when a hard thing had been done. Delphine went rigid for a moment. The rigidity was not rejection. It was surprise, the physical surprise of someone who had braced for consequences for so long that kindness caught her unprepared. Then, with the gradual inevitability of cold leaving a stone, the rigidity released. She cried against Merritt's shoulder without volume, without drama, only the sustained exhale of someone who had been carrying something for the entire length of a storm and had just found somewhere to set it down. The grief was real, and its source complicated not only Rutherford Cade, not only that night, but the accumulated weight of understanding who her father was and choosing something different, which was not simple, regardless of how necessary. Around the chamber, people returned their attention to their own lamps, their own cups, their own thoughts, giving her the privacy of public inattention. Outside, the storm continued its indifferent work. The 6th day was the day the shelter itself was tested by nothing except duration, and duration turned out to be its own adversary. Nobody arrived. Nobody left. The wind kept its pressure identical from dawn through the long, featureless afternoon and into the second night without one honest lull. Merritt learned that day what she had suspected in the abstract, which was that a group of people confined together in a limited space develops a rhythm the way a body develops a pulse. And if the rhythm is not tended, it becomes noise, and if it becomes noise, it becomes damage. She counted supplies again. The numbers were what they had been the previous night minus what 11 bodies had consumed in one full cycle. The gap between what she had and what she would need if the storm held another 6 days was already visible. And she did not point at it because pointing at it while nothing could be done about it would introduce a kind of pressure the chamber did not need at that hour. Ottilie began telling stories, not fairy tales, actual accounts. The white lent winter of '56 that had shaped her whole understanding of shelter when her family had survived 11 days under an overturned freight wagon, buried in snow because the wind could not reach them in the dead air space beneath the wagon bed. 3 other families in the same area had died in proper cabins with proper fires. Junia and Elias sat cross-legged in front of her with the attention of children who understood they were being taught something they might need to remember. Tobias, 16 and past the age for children's tales, sat close enough to listen anyway and did not pretend otherwise. Ottilie's voice was thin from age, unadorned by any interest in making the story more than it was, and the story was the more powerful for the absence of ornament. Delphine took Junia through the elementary geometry of knitting with 2 whittled sticks and yarn unraveled from a sock of Ottilie's. Junia's small hands moved through the motions, the way a child's hands move through anything genuinely new, uncertain, then determined, then quietly proud. Hollis watched through the firelight without saying anything. Something in his face during those 4 hours did the work of a year of grief. Ephraim, who had been in the cave alone for 3 months in the winter of 71, checked the curtain twice that day out of pure discipline. It did not need checking. He checked it anyway because the smallest tool for keeping a person alive was the habit of verification independent of feeling. Merritt watched him do it and understood that certain habits were not paranoia. They were the residue of survival. Silas spent the seventh morning doing something no one had asked him to do. He took Elias's boots quietly off the sleeping platform while the boy still slept, examined the interior, and began working on the linings with a needle borrowed from Audley and a strip of leather cut from the inside of his own coat. Elias had lost weight in the days of poor eating. The boots that had fit him a week earlier were now loose enough to raise blisters on any walk of more than a few yards. Silas had noticed this without being told. Silas the carpenter, the man who had once let a roomful of tired men laugh at Merritt's $10 and had led the laughter with the practiced ease of a person who mistook cruelty for authority, worked on those boots for 4 hours. Nobody remarked on it. Nobody thanked him. When Elias woke and pulled the boots on and stood carefully, they fit. Silas nodded once and turned away, and that was the closest Silas Thorne would come to an apology for the man whose child he had helped keep upright, whose father he had called weak 2 months earlier in front of the whole diner. She marked 7 days on nothing. She did not carve a wall. She did not want to. The numbers came to a point on the 7th evening, and she waited until Jonas was awake, until the fire had been built to its working level, until the chamber had settled into the quiet routine it had developed over days. Ephraim tending the fire at intervals, Audley watching the ceiling for any return of condensation, Hollis keeping Junior occupied with small tasks at the supply shelf, Silas working silently on a boot repair that had long since gone beyond its actual requirements because the work kept his hands from being still. She waited until the moment was as ordinary as a moment could be. Then she said it plainly, if the storm doesn't break in 2 days, we will run out of food before it does. The chamber stilled. She did not soften it further. She had spent her working life in environments where honest assessment was the difference between preparation and catastrophe, where the people who survived were the ones who had been told the truth in time to act on it, rather than the comfortable version in time to feel better temporarily. Nobody answered for a long while. Jonas looked at the bean sacks. Silas slowed on the boot. Tobias looked at his bowl. Barnaby Crail stared into the fire and said nothing at all, which was its own significant development. Ephraim quietly, there's a cache above my old cabin. Dried venison if the rats haven't taken it. 200 yards up the east slope. I could go. Silas immediately, nobody's going. Ephraim, I've gone out and worse. Silas, you're 60. No. The argument was small but real, two men of dignity meeting on a question that had no clean answer. Merritt did not enter it. She had heard both sides in advance in her own head. She decided instead to sleep because she needed her mind functional, and she banked the fire for the night with the care that had by then become instinctive. She missed him in the count at first light. Ephraim's coat was gone from the peg Jonas had driven into the western wall. The second lamp, the reserve one, was gone from the shelf. His place on the sleeping platform was empty, the blanket folded, which meant he had prepared. Merritt understood it in 2 seconds. She had not felt him leave, which meant he had gone in the deep hour, when even the alert sleep of a cave full of watchful people goes soft. Jonas read the situation in the same 2 seconds. Silas came awake at the change in her breathing, at the movement in the chamber, and understood almost as fast. His voice was quiet, controlled by respect for the sleeping children, and it did not conceal what was underneath it, fool. Outside, the storm had softened from its worst extremity, but was still fully sufficient to kill a 60-year-old man in 3 hours if he fell and could not get up. Merritt was already at the curtain. She turned. Silas met her eyes. You are not going out in that. Bramble can track him. I can go 200 yards and no farther. If I don't find sign within 200, I turn back. Jonas did not argue with her. He looked at his wife with the specific quality of attention that had grown in him over 8 years and had come to full function over 9 days. He did not tell her not to. He did not tell her to. He picked up the mule rope she kept coiled by the entrance and looped one end around her waist, tied the other to the iron ring he had driven into the rock beside the door 3 weeks earlier, in case we ever need it. His hands moved through the knot with the certainty of a man who had thought through this exact contingency without mentioning it. His voice was low, meant only for her 200. Then you come back if you have to crawl. She took the rope. Bramble went out first. The old hound moved with directional certainty against the wind, nose working through gusts that would have folded a younger dog. Merritt followed by the tension in the rope, and by the shape of the ridge she knew 100 yards upslope, 150, feeling the drag of the wind on her right side, feeling the small, terrible easiness of taking one more step than the plan allowed, refusing it, holding to 200 as an absolute. Bramble barked once low. He was there 60 yards higher than Merritt had gone, but the dog had come back for her, which was how the numbers worked, seated against a slab of rock, right leg twisted at the angle. That meant an ankle had gone somewhere. It should not have gone on ice-glazed stone. The pack of dried venison was on his lap, roughly 8 pounds. The cache had held. His face when he saw her was the face of a man who had done a stupid thing and knew it, and was going to have to live with the knowledge, which was better than the alternative, which was not living at all. His voice came thin under the wind. I was going to be back before you woke. She did not answer. She got him upright by pushing under his good shoulder and taking his weight against her hip, and the wind pushed them both sideways for a step until Bramble came around to Ephraim's other side and pressed against him from below like a moving buttress. 80 yards from the cave, Jonas met them. He did not ask what had happened. He did not need to. He ducked his shoulder under Ephraim's other arm and took the weight, and they moved the last stretch together in the sideways stagger of 3 people moving as one thing. Inside, Ephraim's apology cost him 3 words. I was stupid. Silas without cruelty. Yes, no further sentence was required. The 8 pounds of venison, cut into strips and rationed carefully alongside the beans and the fat they had left, would extend the supply by 5 days. Merritt did the arithmetic while thawing snow ran off Ephraim's coat onto the stone. 5 days meant the shelter could hold until the 12th day of the storm, without hunger becoming the deciding factor. She looked up from the beans and found the room's eyes on her waiting for the number. She gave it to them. 5 more days if the food goes the way I think it goes. 4 to be safe. Silas nodded once. Jonas nodded once. It was enough. The mountain heard the wind stop lying somewhere in the last black hour before the 9th dawn. Merritt was awake for it. She had been awake for the last hour of it, sitting beside the fire, with her knees pulled close, listening the same way she had listened to the storm arriving 9 days earlier, with full attention, cataloging every shift and register. She noticed the change before she could name it. Something in her chest released a tension she had not known she was maintaining continuously, like a rope that had been under load for so long that the absence of load felt like a different kind of wrong before it resolved into relief. Bramble raised her head from the platform edge. The old hound turned her nose toward the entrance curtain, held that position for several seconds, then lowered her head back onto her forepaws with a long exhale that moved her entire ribcage. Not alert, not watchful. Done. Merritt looked at the curtain panels for a long moment. Then she looked around the chamber at the 10 sleeping people in its imperfect warmth, at the fire banked low at the stones, in the ring still radiating at their patient, accumulated level, at the lamp turned down to a thread of light that barely reached the far wall. Elias on his back on the platform chest, rising with the measured evenness of clean sleep. Junia curled against the vacated warmth Bramble had left at the platform's edge. Delphine against the western wall, coat folded under her head, her face in sleep, showing none of the compression it carried when she was awake. Jonas on the platform's near side, one arm across his chest in the posture he always assumed when he was sleeping deeply, his right hand closed even in sleep around the edge of the platform frame, the frame with the iron brackets he had made in the smithy and carried up the ridge without explanation on the 4th morning. She watched her husband's hand on the iron bracket for a moment. Then she turned back to the entrance. Outside, the wind sounded tired. Not gone, but tired. The way an argument sounds when the person making it has begun to doubt his own position. She banked the fire another quarter turn, added no juniper, let the stone ring hold what it had. In another hour, it would be light enough to see the ridge, and the ridge would tell them what the valley had already paid. Silas Thorne was the first one outside. He had been awake perhaps 20 minutes when the light began coming gray through the curtain panels, and he had moved to the entrance with the purposeful quiet of a man who needed to see something with his own eyes before he could accept it as real. He separated the outer panel, stepped into the passage, ducked through. Merritt followed 20 seconds later. The world outside was white in a way that had nothing to do with the aggressive horizontal white of the storm. This was vertical white, settled white, the white of snow that had finished moving. The ridge above them stood clean against a sky that had gone from pewter to a pale, exhausted gray, the kind of gray that preceded color rather than following it. No wind moved at ankle height. No wind moved at any height. The absence of it was so complete it felt structural, as though the air itself had thickened into something that would hold its position for hours before it remembered how to shift again. Silas stood in snow that came to his thighs and looked down the slope toward Asphalt Junction. His silence during the next full minute was more measurable than any sound. He was cataloging what he saw the way a doctor catalogs a body's damage before deciding what can still be saved. The town below them existed only as a series of interruptions in the white, rather than as a coherent collection of structures. Roof lines that stood at wrong angles, walls that stopped before they should have stopped, a chimney standing alone where the building beneath it had given way. The general store sign was gone entirely. The road that ran the main length of Asphalt Junction had become indistinguishable from the land on either side of it, a single undifferentiated white surface that covered everything without editorial comment. The warehouse was still there. Silas's jaw worked once and then settled. The carpenter's eye had done its arithmetic and had arrived at a number that would take 3 weeks of daylight to unwind. Merritt watched him carry that number in the specific stillness of a man who understood for the first time in years that his professional judgment had been asked for by circumstances larger than any commission he had ever taken. Behind them, the curtain panels moved. People came through one at a time, blinking in the gray light, standing in the snow in their coats, with the still slightly dazed quality of people emerging from a protected space into a world that had been reshaped while they were inside it. Audley came out leaning on Ephraim's arm, not because she required physical support, but because the footing was uncertain. She stood in the snow and looked at the valley with the expression of a woman who had lived long enough to have seen versions of this before, which did not make it smaller, only more legible. She recognized what she was looking at. She knew what the recovery would cost. The knowledge did not make her face kind exactly. It made it accurate. Hollis came out carrying Junia against his chest, both of them wrapped in the same quilt they had arrived in, which had long since thawed and dried, and been rewrapped by Delphine, who had taken over the task of managing the bedding rotation with a quiet efficiency that suggested she had been managing domestic logistics in a large household for a long time and had found in it here a form of purpose that felt different from obligation. Junia came fully awake the moment cold air touched her face. She had been awake inside, actually lying with her eyes closed in the particular stillness children learn when they sense the adults around them need quiet. But outside was different. Outside there was something to see. She turned in her father's arms toward the slope, toward the clean white surface of undisturbed snow below the cave entrance, the morning light catching the surface crystals in a way that made the whole hillside seem briefly lit from beneath. She leaned forward. Hollis's grip adjusted to compensate. She leaned further. He let her down. Her boots hit the snow surface and broke through it to the knee on the first step, and she pitched sideways into the drift with a startled, involuntary burst of laughter that broke out of her before she had any choice about it. The sound stopped everyone. After 9 days of wind of structural collapse in the valley below, of people trying very hard not to make sounds that would frighten other people, of Elias's cough, cycling through the chamber at intervals like a reminder of everything at stake. After 9 days of sounds that all pointed toward cost. A child's laughter in snow carried a quality that was almost violent in its contrast. It hit the chamber's former occupants standing on the hillside with the physical force of something unexpected, something the body had to process before the mind could. Silas turned away from the valley. He faced upslope toward the rock face above the cave entrance with his back to the group. His shoulders moved once. Nobody mentioned what they saw. Ephraim, standing to Merritt's left, made a sound in his throat that was not a word. He cleared it, looked at the sky. Audley's mouth did not move, but the small, deep-set eyes above it filled and did not spill, which was the version of that particular event she permitted herself in public. Jonas had come out last. He stood beside Merritt with their arms almost touching, not quite both of them, watching Junia try to stand in the snowfall, laugh again, try again with Hollis's hand extended toward her. The morning light was strengthening. In another hour, it would be full gray daylight, which in December in Wyoming was as close to brightness as the season allowed. It would be enough. Jonas's hand found hers. Not taken, offered. His knuckles against her knuckles, waiting. She turned her hand over. He held it with the grip he used on things he intended to keep. Neither of them looked at the other. They watched Junia finally find her footing in the snow legs, wide arms out for balance, laughing at the difficulty of it with the effortless shamelessness of 8 years old. Silas reached Rutherford Cade's warehouse before anyone else had finished descending the ridge. He had not said he was going. He had simply begun walking down the slope with the focused, grounding pace of a man whose mind was already at his destination. Merritt noticed him go. She did not try to precede him. This was not her errand to run first. The road into Ashfall Junction was navigable only because the snow had settled and compacted rather than drifted, which meant it bore weight without collapsing. The main street was buried to varying depths, shallower in the center, where the wind had scoured deeper at the building edges where it had piled. 3 roof lines were wrong in ways that meant the structures beneath them had failed. The church's west wall had bowed outward at the base, though the roof appeared intact. The diner sign was down the pole, snapped at its base, the painted wood face down in snow. Rutherford Cade's warehouse stood, not untouched. The north-facing boards showed weather damage along the upper courses where wind-driven snow had worked at the joints. But standing solidly, fully, completely standing in a way that required explanation once you had walked through everything surrounding it. The elements of deliberate preparation were visible to anyone who knew how to look. Additional support bracing visible through the sidewall gaps where a board had shifted. Clay packing in the upper corner joints, gray-white against the wood, applied with the particular consistency of material mixed to the right moisture content rather than forced on dry. The snow around the foundation walls had been cut back in channels before the storm, reducing lateral pressure on the base structure. This was not the work of a man who had prepared against the possibility of structural failure. This was the work of a man who had understood exactly what was coming. Silas hit the warehouse door with his fist 3 times. The sound carried down the street in the still morning air. People who had come down the ridge with the cave's former occupants stopped walking when they heard it. People who had survived the storm in their own structures, the ones still standing, came to their windows. Rutherford Cade opened the door after a pause long enough to be intentional. He was dressed completely as though he had been awake for hours, which he probably had. A man as attentive to his own interests as Cade would have been monitoring the storm's end with at least as much care as Merritt had. He looked at Silas with the measured composure of a man who had prepared for this moment alongside every other preparation he had made. The interior of the warehouse was visible beyond his shoulder. Barrel stacks, sack rows, the organized abundance of a well-managed inventory, lamp oil in the far corner in the quantity that had been missing from every shop in town for 6 weeks, flour in barrels whose lids were properly sealed against moisture, salt pork in the cold storage section that ran along the north wall. Enough for weeks. For everyone. Hollis had come down the ridge faster than his daughter's recovery suggested he should have been walking. He arrived at the warehouse door with Junia still against his chest, having carried her the whole way down, not because she could not walk, but because he needed something to hold. He stood behind Silas in the snow and looked past Rutherford Cade into the warehouse interior with an expression that moved through several stages before settling into something that was not anger, because anger implied the situation was surprising. His voice was not raised. It was the voice of a man saying a thing he had known for a long time in the specific register of someone who had finally stopped pretending he did not know it. You let people suffer so you could keep the ledger clean. Nora Holcomb. 3 families you cut credit on the week before the worst storm in 20 years. Rutherford's composure was genuine rather than performed, which was the thing about him that made it worse. He believed in the reasonableness of his own position. He was not defending against an accusation. He was explaining a system to people he felt had not yet grasped its logic. I protected what was mine to protect. Every man in this territory does the same. Merritt had come down the slope at her own pace with Jonas beside her. She arrived at the edge of the gathering that had formed in the street outside the warehouse. A dozen people, then, more coming from the direction of the surviving structures, moving with the careful footwork of people navigating unfamiliar snow depth. She did not push to the front. She stood where she could see Rutherford's face. He had not looked at Delphine yet. His daughter was standing at the left edge of the group, close enough to Merritt that their coat sleeves were 6 inches apart. Rutherford's eyes had registered her position in the first second. He was too attentive not to have registered it. But he had not addressed, it had not looked at her directly, was managing the fact of her presence by treating it as peripheral in the way a man might manage a weather change while continuing an argument. Merritt waited until the exchanges in front of the warehouse door had reached their natural pause. The point where Hollis had said what he had come to say, where Silas had run out of the specific vocabulary of outrage, and the air had gone still with the weight of what everyone was standing inside together. Then she moved forward, not quickly, not with theatrical purpose, but with the directional certainty of someone who knew where she was going before she arrived. She stopped 3 feet from Rutherford Cade in the snow. He met her eyes with the gray, measuring attention he had been directing at her since October, the expression of a man who had been assessing a threat and had not yet determined whether he had miscalculated its magnitude. Her voice, when it came, carried none of the volume the moment might have permitted. It carried the register she had used in field tents when she wanted a truth to lodge inside a man rather than pass through him. You prepared. She let that land first because it was true. Because acknowledging what was true was the foundation of everything else. Better than most people. You know how cold travels through wood. You know how to pack clay against wind infiltration. You cut those snow channels yourself. I can see from the distance between them that it was one man's arms, not two. Her eyes moved briefly toward the warehouse walls and back to his face. You understood exactly what was coming. You had everything that was needed. Rutherford did not look away. He had the quality of a man who had learned that looking away was a form of concession. You protected your inventory. She said this with the flatness of a physician reading back a temperature. That's a different thing than what you just told Hollis. Her eyes moved briefly toward the interior of the warehouse, toward the flour barrels, toward the lamp oil, toward the salt pork sitting in organized abundance, while 3 houses within 200 yards of them had been without food or heat for the last 4 days of the storm. You protected objects. You chose them over the people who needed them while knowing what those people needed, which is the part that matters. Ignorance is a different kind of failure. Rutherford's mouth tightened at one corner. Not quite a response. More like a face making an adjustment to contain one. The silence in the street had the texture of a verdict being read to someone who already knew the outcome, not because anyone had decided something collectively, but because everyone standing in the snow outside Rutherford Cade's warehouse had arrived at the same understanding simultaneously through different routes, from 9 days of being in the cold, or 9 days of being kept from the cold, by a man who had controlled the difference. Delphine had not moved from her position at the edge of the group, but her stillness was different from her father's stillness. His was the stillness of a man holding a position. Hers was the stillness of someone who had already finished moving. She had crossed the distance between them on the 5th night of the storm in the dark, carrying flour in one arm and pine resin syrup in the other. And the physical distance she maintained from her father now was simply the visible form of a decision already made in full. Rutherford looked at his daughter finally. He looked at where she was standing. He said nothing. There was nothing in his expression that looked like remorse. What was there was more complex than that. The expression of a man confronting the specific cost of a choice that had seemed from inside his own logic entirely reasonable, discovering that the cost included something he had not adequately valued when he made the calculation. He had valued his inventory correctly. He had not valued his daughter's opinion of him at its accurate price. Nobody said anything more to Rutherford Cade that morning. Nobody needed to. The warehouse doors stayed open and people went in, and the supplies moved out into Asphalt Junction without a ledger entry being made by anyone. There was no vote, no speech, no one appointed to redistribute. The town simply took what it needed and left what it did not. And Rutherford stood at the doorway of his own building for the full duration of it, watching, saying nothing, understanding, without being told that if he tried to stop the exchange would continue anyway, and that what he was watching leave was less than what had already left him when his daughter had stepped over his threshold into a storm. The rebuilding of Asphalt Junction took 3 weeks of days that started at first light and ended when the light failed. Silas worked at the center of it, as he always had, organizing the work, assigning the tasks, coordinating the sequence in which structures needed to be addressed to prevent secondary failures from compounding the primary ones. He did this with the competence that had always been his genuine quality, the part of him that the laughter in diners had been attached to, like luggage to a traveler, inseparable, but not actually the traveler. The difference in those 3 weeks was a question he had not asked before. He asked it for the first time on the second day of repairs, standing with Merritt at the corner of a cabin whose east wall had twisted off its base from wind pressure loading, trying to determine the reattachment sequence. His voice was professional, the voice he used when he wanted accurate information rather than confirmation of something he had already decided. Wind came from the north-northwest. Merritt looked at the twist in the timber, at the way the wall had failed inward at its base, rather than at its top, at the direction the twist ran north-northwest at primary onset. Shifted northwest on the third day. The pressure came down the ridge face at an angle that loaded the east walls harder than north walls for the last 4 days. He absorbed this, looked at the twisted corner, recalculated his sequence. He did not acknowledge that he had just asked a woman something structural, because acknowledging it would have made it a larger thing than it needed to be, which would have made it harder to do again. He asked her something structural every day for 3 weeks. By the end, he had stopped noticing that he was asking. Jonas moved through those weeks with a quality Merritt had not seen in him before. Not contentment, which implied satisfaction with a static situation, but something more active. Engagement. He went from cabin to cabin with a purpose that was not solely about the work itself, that had something to do with how the work connected him to the people receiving it. He renegotiated 3 outstanding ironwork debts in that period, reducing them without announcement or documentation, simply telling Hollis that the balance was settled, telling the Holcombs the kind of accounting adjustment that did not appear in any ledger, but whose effects distributed through the community the way heat distributed through stone, evenly without direction. Merritt watched him do this from across the street one afternoon, standing in front of the general store with a list in her hand. She watched him talking to Hollis at the corner. The slight adjustment in Hollis's posture when Jonas made the offer. The particular straightening of a man being released from a weight he had been bending under long enough to forget what upright felt like without it. Jonas walked away from the exchange without looking back, without waiting for gratitude to form into something he would have to receive, moving on to the next thing, with the efficient pace of a man who had more work than daylight. She watched until he turned the corner. Then she added 3 items to her list that had not been on it before. Tobias Crale appeared at the smithy door one afternoon in the 3rd week of the repairs, hat in hand, the expression of someone who had rehearsed an opening sentence several times and was now hoping the rehearsal had been sufficient. He wanted to learn, not smithing necessarily, though he would not refuse it if offered, but the more general skill of making things that held under pressure. He had watched Jonas work during the storm preparation, and during the cave's 9 days had watched him apply his particular form of competence to whatever the situation required, had come to understand that the quality he was watching was not about the specific craft, but about the relationship between a person and the material reality in front of them. Jonas looked at him for a moment, then he turned back to the forge, picked up his tongs. Start with the bellows. Feel how the fire responds before you try to direct it. Tobias stayed until dark. He came back the next morning. Barnaby Crale, told about this by his son over supper, said nothing. But Tobias noticed the following week that his father had reduced the frequency of a particular complaint about a particular injustice of the world. The complaint that had always sounded to Tobias like a man describing a problem he had decided not to solve. Merritt's medical work expanded in the weeks after the storm in ways she had not planned for, but recognized as inevitable. People who had been treating their own ailments for years, who had defaulted to waiting because reaching out required either money or the particular willingness to admit limitation, that the isolated West discouraged, began stopping by the cabin with questions they framed as hypothetical before revealing they were personal. She answered them the same way she answered everything, directly, with the information that was accurate, rather than the information that was comforting, offering what she knew. Without charging rates, she had always considered morally insupportable for knowledge that prevented death. Audley formalized this in the way Audley formalized things, which was by treating it as already official rather than by proposing it and waiting for consensus. She began referring people to Merritt's cabin with the confident specificity of someone sending them to an established institution. By April, Merritt had something that resembled a practice which she had not had before, which she had not sought, which arrived as the direct consequence of people having seen what she knew how to do. The cave changed its identity in the weeks after the storm, quietly, without ceremony. People came back up the ridge not to seek refuge, but to contribute to it. Hollis brought a second cord of split juniper, stacked it under canvas wrap near the entrance, with the knowledge of someone who understood now what that wood was worth in real rather than theoretical terms. Audley brought 3 additional blankets she had patched through the winter with remnants from 2 households, folded with the tight precision of someone who valued storage space. Silas fabricated a proper door for the cave entrance, hinged, well-fitted, with a draft seal along the bottom edge made from the same split pine wedge technique Jonas had used on the original curtain mountings. The 2 men worked on it together for a full afternoon, which was the closest Silas Thorne would ever come to a formal apology to Jonas Ainsworth. They spoke about hinge placement and about the grain of the pine and about the specific angle that would let the door swing under load without binding. And when it was done, Silas ran his palm along the finished edge and nodded once, which for Silas was as close as he came to acknowledging that another man's work had improved him. The supply shelf system expanded not through anyone's single decision, but through accumulated contribution, each family adding something to the common reserve that reflected what they had learned about their own vulnerability during the 9 days. Hollis added salt. The Holcombs added extra clay and sealed tins for packing draft gaps. Delphine added 3 more jars of pine resin syrup made in the small room above the dry goods store, where she was working now for wages she controlled herself. The name came from the children. Junia used it first, telling Tobias to meet her at Merritt Hollow when they were arranging to collect snow samples for something she was investigating on the cave floor. Tobias used it back without correcting it to anything else because it was accurate in a way that required no decoration. Within 2 weeks, it was the only name anyone used for the place, said with the matter-of-fact ease of something that had always existed under that designation. Rutherford Cade reopened his warehouse. He stood behind the counter, as he always had, with the ledger open on its surface, with the careful, organized precision of a man whose relationship to commerce was the most stable relationship in his life. People came in. They purchased with cash when they had it, credit when they did not. The mechanics of the system continued, but the system had changed in the way that systems change when everyone involved understands something about it they had not understood before. Nobody signed new extended credit arrangements. Nobody accepted terms they had not read fully. 3 families who had maintained accounts through obligation rather than necessity settled them during the first month and shifted their purchasing to seasonal cash-only terms. Rutherford made no comment on this. He recorded the transactions. He continued opening at 7 in the morning. He continued closing at 6. Delphine did not return to the warehouse or to her father's house. She did not return because her father had not asked her to return, which was its own answer to a question she had stopped expecting him to resolve. She had occasional sightings of him on the main street, the gray figure in his coat with a ledger under one arm, and she watched these the way you watch weather you had decided to stop arguing with. Not without feeling, without the expectation that the feeling would change anything. Merritt checked on her twice in the first month, not with the hovering attention of someone managing another person's recovery, but with the purposeful brevity of someone making sure a thing was standing before moving on. Delphine was standing. She was working. She had begun talking to Audley in the evenings, and whatever passed between them in those conversations remained private as it should. Ephraim Voss came back up to the cave on the first morning in March when the temperature climbed above freezing for the first time since October. He came alone, which was how he preferred to move through the world. Merritt heard his boots on the slope and recognized the sound before she saw him, the particular cadence of a man who had been walking these specific rocks for 20 years, whose feet knew the surface below the snow the way hands know familiar tools. She was already inside the secondary chamber, crouching in front of the rear wall with a lamp she no longer strictly needed because the light coming through the entrance was sufficient and growing. The lamp was habit. The lamp was also honest acknowledgement that the work she was about to do deserved light. She controlled rather than light that came and went with the clouds. She had the small knife Jonas had left in the cave. Not a good one. A secondary blade he used for marking wood before cutting with a handle worn smooth from years of use. She was holding it, not yet using it. The knife marks on the rear wall caught the lamplight from their edges. Ephraim's weeks counted one at a time in the winter of 71. Each mark a compact statement of persistence. All of them together a record of something endured. Below the lowest cluster, slightly to the right, Jonas's single letter. The O cut small 3 inches high, the strokes firm without being deep made in the middle of the night when no one was watching. She had been thinking about what to add to it since the storm ended. Ephraim's voice came from the secondary chamber entrance behind her. She had not heard him enter the main chamber. He moved through the cave the way he moved through everything in his life without announcing himself. Only one. She did not turn. I came up here to make one. I came up here because my cabin's cold in the morning still. He settled against the wall to her left. She could hear the specific sound of his coat against that section of stone which she had learned to identify during the 9 days when every sound in the chamber had its own signature. But yes, also to watch. She looked at the marks, counted them again though she already knew the number. 84. 12 weeks of solitary survival in a place that had kept him warm enough to keep counting. She looked at Jonas's letter, one mark made not to count duration, but to record presence, to place himself in the record of the cave without claiming more space than he had earned. Then she placed the knife tip against the stone slightly to the left of Jonas's letter, lower by 4 inches, so it sat closer to the floor where the most people had spent their time in the dark. She cut one mark, one line, clean, unremarkable beside the decades of accumulated evidence above it. One winter. Her voice was low, meant for the stone as much as for Ephraim. One mark. You made 84 counting your own survival. I don't need to count mine. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him thinking in the way she had learned to hear him think during the 9 days, a particular quality of silence that preceded something considered rather than immediate. One mark for yourself. Or one mark for all of them. She took her hand from the wall. The mark was done. For the cave. One mark for what the cave did. Ephraim considered this. Then she heard him get to his feet with the careful leverage of a man respecting joints that had carried him over difficult country for 6 decades. His boots moved toward the main chamber entrance. From the main chamber, his voice reached her one more time in the tone he used for things he had already thought through completely. It kept you all alive. That's not the same as what it did for me. She turned to look at where he had been standing. He was gone. His footsteps already moving toward the cave entrance, already becoming the sound of someone ascending rather than someone remaining. She looked at the single mark on the wall, then at Jonas's O beside it, then at the 84 marks above both, each one a week, of something she could understand, but had not been required to live through the long accounting of a man alone in the dark, counting toward a spring that had eventually arrived. She extinguished the lamp. The secondary chamber went not dark, but dim, the March light from the entrance carrying farther than it had in months, reaching into spaces that winter had kept in permanent shadow. She could see the rear wall clearly enough now without artificial light. She could see all the marks. She put the knife in her coat pocket and walked out through the main chamber. Spring arrived in Asphalt Junction the way it always arrived in the Wyoming high country, not as a sudden gift, but as a slow renegotiation of terms. The snow retreated up the slopes, first leaving the valley floor muddy for weeks before the mud firmed into workable ground. The creek that ran behind the smithy ran high with melt, louder than usual, insistent, making the particular announcement that water makes when it has been held in solid form for too long. Jonas reopened the smithy on the first week of March and spent the first 3 days clearing the backlog of work that 9 days of storm plus 3 weeks of recovery had accumulated. The sound of the forge hammer reached the main street of Asphalt Junction regularly, which had been the case for 8 years. But something in how people heard it had shifted. Hollis came in for a hinge repair and stayed for 2 hours, not because the hinge required 2 hours, but because the conversation didn't stop at the hinge. Silas came in for nails, the ordinary transaction he had made dozens of times, and stayed to ask Jonas's opinion about the load-bearing capacity of the east wall reconstruction approach he was planning for the church. Jonas gave his opinion. It was specific, technical, directly useful. Silas listened to it with the same careful attention he had begun giving to Merritt's observations about wind direction. Luther Crane, who was Barnaby's older brother by birth and by disposition, came in the second week of March and stood in the doorway of the smithy for a long minute before he said what he had come to say. He apologized to Jonas for something he had said about the Ainsworth cabin in the spring of the previous year, a comment about the quality of the joinery. He had been drinking when he said it. Half the town had heard. He apologized in front of two other men who happened to be in the smithy in daylight without preamble. He did not offer excuses. Jonas received the apology with a single nod and told the man which hinge size he needed for the barn door he had come in to discuss. That was the end of it. But it was the beginning of a change in the town's ordinary weather that was measurable across the following weeks in small ways, in who said good morning to whom, in which conversations happened in the open rather than behind closed doors, in what the town chose to remember about itself. On an afternoon in the second week of April, Merritt and Jonas were both in the cave together. She was reorganizing the supply shelves by category after a restocking run. He was fitting the new door Silas had built into its frame with the final adjustments that made it seal correctly on all four sides. Bramble was outside in the weak spring sun doing something on the slope that involved several investigative circles and a great deal of nose work on the exposed rock face where snow had retreated. Jonas had been working on the door's lower corner for 20 minutes getting the fit precise, making the small corrections the difference between adequate and correct required. When it was done, when the door seated in its frame without gap, without wobble, when the draft seal along the bottom edge made full contact with the threshold stone, at every point he opened it and closed it once, feeling the fit through his hands, and then he stood back from it. Then he went to the rear wall of the main chamber to the tool corner where Merritt's secondary knife was resting on a ledge. He picked it up, carried it to the wall beside the cave entrance. Not the rear wall, not the secondary chamber, but the main wall to the right of the door he had just hung. He cut one mark at shoulder height where it would be visible to someone entering rather than to someone already inside. He put the knife back and returned to his tools. Merritt watched him do this without speaking. The mark was not a letter this time. It was a simple vertical line identical in form to hers and to Ephraim's marks, indistinguishable from any of them, if you did not know whose hand had made it. He had placed it at the entrance rather than at the deep interior wall. Not a record of survival. A welcome. She finished reorganizing the shelf she was working on. The bean sacks went at the back, the salt tins at the front for easier access, the lamp oil in the corner where temperature stayed most stable. Everything in its position for the next time it was needed. Outside, Bramble barked once, not an alarm the bark she used when she found something interesting on the slope that warranted human attention. Neither of them moved immediately toward the door. They let the old hound investigate whatever she had found. The spring light through the new door fell across the cave floor in a clean rectangle, strong enough to read by, strong enough to work by. The lamp on the shelf was full. She had filled it last week as she filled it every week, the habit of maintenance that kept options available regardless of what the season decided to do. Merritt looked at the lit rectangle on the floor, thought about the lamp. She left it on the shelf. The light from outside was sufficient. It would be sufficient for months now, through the long days, through the growing season, through the work that needed doing before the first leaves turned again. The cave would be dark again in November when it mattered. She would light the lamp in November. She picked up her coat. Jonas was already at the door. Bramble had stopped barking. Whatever she had found on the slope had been resolved to her satisfaction. The old hound's amber eyes would be tracking something invisible in the air above the valley, some information about the season encoded in pressure, or scent, or the particular angle of the afternoon light. Merritt stepped through the door Silas Thorne had built, hung in the frame. Jonas had fitted set into the entrance of a cave she had bought for $10 in December, while the men in a warm diner had decided she was the kind of fool who did not come along too often. The valley below was clean. The air carried the specific mineral smell of warming rock and running water. From somewhere on the lower slope, children's voices rose and fell in the rhythm of a game that had no concern for anything that had happened in the dark months behind it. One of the voices was Junia's. Merritt could tell by the register higher than the others, with a carrying quality that suggested the child had learned somewhere in the cave over 9 days that her voice had reach. She pulled the door shut behind her. The draft seal made full contact on all four sides. The cave was quiet inside, holding its stored coolness against the April warmth, waiting with the patience of stone for the season that would make it necessary again. Jonas was already 3 steps down the slope, moving toward the valley with the purposeful ease of a man going toward work, he understood. Bramble was beside him, matching his pace, her gray muzzle tipped up into the clean air. Merritt stood at the closed door a moment longer. She had bought a hole in the ground for $10 in the last week of autumn and had spent the winter learning what it was. It was not what the men in halberds had said it was. It was not entirely what she had said it was, either because she had understood its thermal properties correctly, but had not predicted its other function, the way a space becomes more than its physical specifications when people need it. The way warmth shared across days between strangers accumulates into something that changes the people sharing it. She had thought she was building a system. She had built something you could not draw a plan for. The children's voices rose again from the slope below, and the valley spread out in its April state, damaged, partially reconstructed, bearing the visible marks of what it had been through in the specific way that things bear marks when they have been through something real. Not erased, changed, still standing. She walked down the mountain toward Asphalt Junction with her coat open in the spring air, and no particular urgency about anything the afternoon still had to offer. Which was, she understood, its own kind of wealth. The kind that had nothing to do with inventory or ledger entries, or the $10 she had spent on a crack in dead earth, and everything to do with what that crack had held when holding was what the world required. Halfway down the ridge, she stopped to look back once. The cave entrance from that distance was almost invisible against the stone face the way it had been the first time she had seen it in Mordecai Pike's company in the last week of October. A goat hole, that was what he had called it. She had not corrected him then because she had not yet known what to call it herself. She had a name for it now, and it belonged to the children who had used it first. And the name was accurate in the way names become accurate when they are earned rather than given. Marrow-light hollow. The word for the deep interior warmth of a bone, and the word for the specific quality of light that persists when the fire has gone down, but the stones still remember. She had not chosen those two words. Junia and Tobias had chosen them without knowing what they were doing in the way children sometimes name things more precisely than adults would have. She turned back toward the valley. Jonas had reached the trail split below. Bramble had already gone ahead of him toward the cabin. The smithy chimney was already producing smoke, which meant Tobias had arrived first and had started the fire, which he had begun doing 3 times a week since March, as an apprentice does when his instruction includes trust as one of the tools he is learning to hold. She heard faintly the sound of a hammer against iron from the direction of the smithy, then a second hammer lighter tentative following the first with the careful timing of someone learning the rhythm. 2 hammers now, where there had been one for 8 years. She walked down toward the sound. At the edge of Asphalt Junction, Delphine was standing outside the dry goods store with a small basket of jars delivering the week's syrup order to Ottilie, who had established herself as the informal distribution point for anything Merritt or Delphine produced that the town might need. The 2 women were talking in the ordinary way that 2 women talk when they have found each other through hard weather and have decided the friendship is worth continuing. Delphine's face, when she saw Merritt approaching, lifted in a small smile that had not been in her repertoire before December. Ottilie raised one hand in greeting, the fingers stiff from age and cold, but the intent clear. Merritt returned the gesture and continued past them toward the smithy. She would come back to speak with Delphine later. Some conversations were better held in the evening, with warm cups between 2 people, than in the middle of the town's afternoon business. She thought walking of the $10 once more, and of Mordecai Pike, who had left Asphalt Junction in early February for a mining prospect in the Black Hills that would probably fail as his previous prospects had failed, but who had, in his one final transaction before leaving, given her the piece of paper that had made everything else possible. She would not see him again. She hoped he found what he was looking for. She suspected he would not. She thought of her first husband dead now for 18 years, and of the young widow she had been at 22, sitting on a union hospital bench with no home to return to and no name on any pay roster. And she thought of how the woman she had been then would have looked at the woman she was now walking into a Wyoming town in April sunlight and would not have recognized her because that woman had not yet learned that survival was not the goal. The goal was the thing that came after survival, which was the ordinary business of days. The smithy door was open. Jonas was at the anvil. Tobias was at the bellows. The fire was already the correct color for the work at hand, which meant Tobias had learned the fire, which meant he was ready to learn the metal. Jonas would teach him. He would teach him in the way he taught everything, without commentary, by showing rather than saying, by expecting the boy to watch and to remember. Merritt stood in the doorway a moment before either of them noticed her. She watched her husband work. She watched the boy who was becoming a different kind of man than his father had been. She watched the smoke from the forge rise straight up in the still spring air, and she thought about convection and about the 8 inches of offset that had been the difference between smoke filling a room and smoke going where it was supposed to go. And she thought about how most of the important lessons of her life had been 8 inches away from the mistake she had been about to make. Jonas looked up. He saw her. He did not stop working, but his mouth moved slightly in the way that in him was the equivalent of a full smile in another man. And Tobias at the bellows followed his teacher's gaze and saw her and straightened and then continued the rhythm he had been taught, because a good bellows hand does not stop for greetings. She stepped inside. The forge was warm and the fire was steady, and the 2 hammers began again in their new coordinated rhythm. An asphalt junction, damaged and standing, held its April afternoon around her, the way a well-built room holds heat. And she understood in that moment, as she had understood in fragments across the winter, that she had come out of the cave not with the same self she had taken into it, but with something added, some knowledge about her own capacity that would not leave her, that would sit at the base of every decision she made from that day forward, the way a foundation sits under a house it will never see. Outside, in a place she had bought for $10 in December, 3 marks stood on the wall inside the entrance to a hollow named by children, and the light through the new door fell across them, and the stones in the ring kept the memory of every fire that had ever been lit within them. And the mountain that had listened once to something it had not yet seen was quiet in the way mountains are quiet when they have said what they came to say. She turned to the workbench beside the smithy door where Jonas had left a horseshoe half finished the night before. She picked up the smaller hammer that had always been hers when she came to help him in the years before she had understood that helping was its own kind of learning. The weight of it was familiar. The handle had darkened over 8 years with the oil of 2 people's hands. She began to work.